This meeting will now come to order. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see such a good turnout for this event. And, you know, I appreciate everybody getting out and driving from wherever you drove to get here and participate in this. And this is the annual joint, I guess you all know where you are, but it's the annual joint meeting of Vermont Affordable Housing Coalition and the Vermont Coalition in Homelessness. In case you're here and you meant to be somewhere else, then you can leave. But otherwise, welcome. I'm going to let Josh, did I introduce myself? No. I don't think so. My name is Ted Wimpy, and I am chair of the Affordable Housing Coalition Steering Committee. In my day job, I am director of the Fair Housing Project of CVOEO, which is a statewide program. And before we begin everybody's introductions, I'm going to let Josh make a little statement.
Good morning, Josh Davis from Groundworks Collaborative in Randolph. I'm also the co-chair of the Vermont Coalition in Homelessness, along with Rebecca, so welcome this morning. Unfortunately, we're going to start off on a tragic note, and I would like to introduce Rob Farrell, who is here representing Good Samaritan Haven, just to make an announcement about an unfortunate incident that recently happened.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I am Rob Farrell, the new program manager at the Good Samaritan Haven, and with a heavy heart, I have some very sad news to share that our executive director, Brooke Jenkins, lost her son last Thursday evening. And we wanted to make sure to let folks know as we get more information. Any donations or thoughts or prayers can certainly be sent to Good Samaritan Haven, but we wanted to let folks know this. Thank you for letting me take the lead.
And that is sad news, but thank you for being here and making that announcement. I think maybe I see a guest, Senate President Pro Tem Tim Ashe, way back there. Welcome, Tim. You want to come on up here? Tim's been involved in housing issues for a long time. Thanks for coming.
Can people hear me if I speak at this level? That work? I think I prefer to do that. And I think I'm safe with my gesticulating with the space I've created. Some of you know my roots are in affordable housing, working with Ted at CVOEO, running the mobile home project. Also 8 years at Cathedral Square. And so the issues that most of you work in every day are things that not only are of great interest to me, but I have some fluency in. And as I was listening to the introductions, one of the things that really stands out is the growing appreciation outside your advocacy work for what you have all known for a very long time, which is how interconnected all the different services need to be in order to really improve people's lives. So when I first attended meetings, either here or nearby, of this coalition, it was rare that you would have someone from the domestic violence organizations here. And yet, obviously, for many people whose housing is, they're vulnerable in terms of their housing security, or homeless or at risk of homelessness, domestic violence is going to be even greater threat to those individuals. So some of the issues I'll talk about relate to that. But also, whether it's mental health services, whether it's services for seniors or people with disabilities, the fact that outside this room, people now appreciate that those things all have to be viewed as part of a whole and not, little piecemeal programs here, programs there. Ultimately, we're serving actual human beings, and actual human beings, at least the ones that I have met, are not like 1/10 CVOEO client, 1/10 this person. They have one goal, which is to live a decent life with some security, and all of you working together help make that a reality. So I typically tend to go a little dark, so I'm going to begin with some positive, and then I might get a little dark, but then I'll try and end positive. So if you see, like, I don't know, start going like this if you feel like you can't take anymore, somewhere in the middle. But I want to cite two things. That the first doesn't really sound like a housing issue, but it relates to some of the domestic violence and other issues. And it speaks to what we can achieve when we all have a common objective. And this year, it was, I don't think, a surprise to anyone that this year we passed a number of gun safety legislation, 3 separate pieces of gun safety legislation. And I'll briefly describe 3 because not all of them get the same amount of fanfare with the press and the way it's reported. So what was most frequently discussed was what we call universal background checks. Okay, universal background checks is a simple notion that anyone purchasing firearms should have their name put in a registry to determine whether that person is legally entitled to own a firearm. Under current law, if I go to, oh my God, of all the people, Earhart, I'm blaming, it's too late, I'm blaming you anyways. All right, so whoever's phone it really was, you have just scored, because Earhart took the fall. So, but just to put the importance in, now Earhart, stop. The importance of universal background checks, it really boils down to this very simple notion, because sometimes you hear about all the support for it and you think, okay, but what's it actually do? If right now, prior to this law going, well, 6 months ago, if you wanted to go to Walmart and buy a hunting rifle, they would put your name into the registry and determine whether you were legally allowed to own a firearm. Okay, they have to do that by law. However, if you go on Craigslist and want to buy an AR-15 from some nobody and go to a parking lot and get it, you didn't have to go through a background check. So the irony was the people who were most likely to be following all the rules, making sure they're not selling a firearm to a dangerous person, they were doing all the things the right way, exactly where you would suspect things might be the squishiest with the most likelihood that guns get in the wrong hands. There were no requirements whatsoever. So that was one of the key pieces that we put in. 2, we made it so that in domestic violence situations, it's much easier for law enforcement to communicate with the courts and prosecutors in real time to remove firearms in a situation where domestic violence has either occurred or has been suspected to occur. In many rural parts of the state, where the percentage of firearm ownership is probably much higher than in places like where I live in Burlington, state trooper responding to a call in the middle of the night is often very worried about leaving after a call about a domestic situation because they have no idea what's being left behind once they leave, and it might be 30 minutes to the nearest police station. So we've made it easier for law enforcement to remove firearms and protect potential victims or actual victims in those situations. We also passed something called a red flag law. Red flag law basically means if someone you know is exhibiting behaviors and saying things like, I'm upset and I'm planning to go to my workplace and shoot it up because I'm so mad at these people. An individual can contact law enforcement and communicate what they believe is a very real threat, and then there is a process by which the firearms would be removed from that individual for a period of time. Less understood about the gun safety legislation is how important it will be to help reduce the prevalence, which is a very serious problem in this state, of suicide by firearm. About 86% or so of all firearm deaths in Vermont over the last 5 years were suicides, not homicides. We hear about the homicides more frequently, suicide frequently much more private thing. So we know from evidence around the country that with laws like this in place, family members who suspect that someone they know or a friend who's going through very difficult or acute stress, they can help intervene to protect that individual. I mentioned, I guess in closing, to talk about this particular set of laws, because it's really not a housing first sort of issue, is that there were some people whose minds were changed about gun control. Our governor should be commended for having stepped up after Fairhaven and decided that it was the right thing to do to make sure that we had these kind of protections in place that are very reasonable. But I also want everyone to, over the coming months and into next year, remember that on this and many other issues, we often forget about the first people in, the ones who actually believed in these policies when it was not popular, when they had risk to their political futures. We're actually in Orange County right now, and I'll just tell you, Mark McDonald, who's a state senator from this county, he was being told, you might lose your election if you vote for gun control. But he voted for it anyways, and he always said he would. So on almost every major important issue, a lot of the attention gets focused on the last people in, but don't take for granted those first people in. I'd like to talk about a few highlights from the last legislative session, and it's a mix of things we stopped from happening, and then a mix of proactive things that we did happen. I know you guys are going to be talking about the housing bond in a more focused presentation, so I'm not going to spend much time there because I know that's probably the most significant new resource that was put on the table to develop housing. So I'm going to start with a few things that we stopped from happening. So these are some things that were proposed in the governor's budget that we did not accept, and we found ways to restore. We prevented a $4.3 million cut to the Developmental Services Program. Many of you serve clients who receive support from that. We prevented the elimination of the Attendant Care Services Program, which, for those of you who don't know, serves people with very severe disabilities like quadriplegia, MS, and the like. We proposed cuts to primary care and community health clinics. Many of your tenants, those of you who are in the housing provision business, know that many of your clients, like me, go to places like the Community Health Center of Burlington or the network of federally qualified health centers around the state. Those were going to be receiving some pretty significant cuts. We restored that. We reversed the proposed elimination of loan repayment to doctors who serve in medically underserved areas, lots of rural areas, but also sort of niche things like child psychiatry, even in places like Burlington. We, on the positive side, made some really important investments, a 2% increase to the community services, places like the visiting nurses and organizations bureaucratically organized like them. We increased funding for individual development accounts. I know from my time at CVOEO how important those are to many people who are trying to start the smallest of small businesses. We increased for the second year in a row support for mental health employees. So it should go without saying, so I'm going to say it though. We have like some real mental health challenges in this state, and it's a combination of things. It's our facilities, which we have shortage of certain beds. We have people commingled who probably are inappropriately commingled at our state hospital. We have policies which probably need revising to better serve the people of our state. But at its core, we have a personnel problem. We have a system across the state of designated agencies who, because of the meager state support over all these years, we're paying people, as recently as a year ago, $10.50 for frontline work with individuals who sometimes were dangerous, volatile, and you can imagine why some designated agencies had frontline turnover upwards of 50% a year. Now, anybody who's ever had worked in a sort of a client relationship knows that continuity and stability is like one of those things that really helps. If you have 50% turnover at the front line, what does that mean to someone with mental health challenges who's looking for some stability, comfort, companionship, whatever? So over a 2-year period, we've pumped about $17 million in operating money, so this is now annualized, to bring up the pay of those frontline workers. We've also addressed a second piece of this puzzle, which is something that many of you will be familiar with, which is at many of the designated agencies and mental health organizations, what will frequently happen is the best and brightest or some of the highest performers, as they start getting seasoned in their work and really start being acknowledged as a top performer, well, the rest of the world sees that too. So at the Howard Center in my community, people get poached by those who can pay more. So the UVM Medical Center, University of Vermont, and a few other organizations will come into the Howard Center and pick up some of the best people because they can pay sometimes up to 50% more for a job that is effectively the exact same job. So we've targeted some money to some of the specific positions that they were having the most trouble retaining people. So in my opinion, this is not a solution. It's part of the solution to rebuilding what has become a very fractured mental health system. We increased funding for the Working Lands program, so it's now, I believe, $700,000 per year, and then from time to time we supplement that with even more. We added more weatherization dollars, and then we did probably the least sexy thing a politician can do with your tax money, which is we put $15 million into buying down the teacher retirement debt. So, as I say, this is not the most exciting thing. It's not a stump speech item, but over time, one of the things every year when the legislature comes back and you hear about how there's fiscal distress and there's real challenges, one of the least enjoyable causes of our budget pressures each year is the interest we're paying on outstanding debt. By paying in $15 million to buy down our teacher retirement obligation, it's going to save approximately $45 million over time. So it doesn't, it's not the stuff of headlines, but over time it will ease pressure on the general fund so we have more dollars available to support the work that people in here are doing. And then lastly, and this is another unheralded but critical investment which will help many of your clients, we increased the Vermont earned income tax credit from 32 to 36% of the federal credit. Almost all of the people who are eligible for your programs, if they work, are eligible for the earned income tax credit. It is the most successful anti-poverty strategy, in my opinion, in modern American history. Incidentally, Richard Nixon was its initial champion. Take that for what it is. But it enjoys bipartisan congressional support, which is almost impossible, but that says something about it. But increasing it from 32 to 36% is real money right back in the pockets of those who are able to work a little bit. I actually want to commend Janet Ansel, the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, who really did put that on the table. It's one of those things that many, many thousands of people are going to benefit from a little bit. No one of them will know where it came from or who was the originator of the policy, but it's real money one way or the other. I'll close with this, since I've monologued probably longer than Erhard wished, and say that one of the things that a legislator ought to think about every 2 years when it's time to decide whether or not to run for re-election again is, what's the point? Why do I still feel the passion to do the work? Do I still have some vision that's unfulfilled? Do I still believe that I have something to offer, to contribute alongside my peers in the legislature to make the world a better place? And I have found over the last 2 years as the president of the Senate, working with the other 29 people from all parties, that it's been one of the most exciting things that's happened in my life. And as a group, our vision of trying to holistically or comprehensively address poverty remains our single most important priority. Our attempt last year to raise the minimum wage over the course of 4 or 5 years would have helped tens of thousands of Vermonters who need the money the most. It doesn't require a new government program. It only targets those who work, and it gives them a boost. It would have literally put tens of millions of dollars into the pockets of those who work hard every day but get paid jack for it. We proposed and passed a paid leave bill, so those of you who work with young families know how hard it is to find an employer who has the resources to provide a paid leave benefit. This would have provided an employee-financed paid leave program that would have particularly helped young families and those tending to perhaps aging parents or other family members who could be on their last days, but it allows people to have a pretty humane experience with their family members. We proposed environmental things. All of these were vetoed, I should add. We proposed several environmental provisions, which at first do not seem like housing issues until you realize who the people are that are most likely to suffer from environmental pollution. So we passed a bill to try and make polluters responsible for medical testing in areas like Bennington, where you've seen PFOAs, but that's just the beginning. They had the dumb luck in a way of testing and knowing that they have this contamination. Other communities will be coming forward, and they will have the same problem, and it's the taxpayers right now who have to foot the bill. And so for those of us who believe it should be the polluters, we will be back on that front. On water quality, many of you know that our lakes are not in good shape. Many decades of lack of investment have put us in some difficult times. And so this past year we had a veto threat over a bill that was just going to come up with a plan to fund the waters. So we're still in this holding pattern of getting real about cleaning up the lake and waterways. The legislature has a responsibility, as does our governor, to figure this out and come up with a long-term plan, which so far has been left wanting. So I'll leave it there, except to say that when it comes to this broad attempt to address poverty issues, housing, public safety, community safety, like the gun safety legislation, work and service opportunities for those who could use it, especially young people from families that don't have a lot of support at home, nutrition programs, support and services, and wraparound, like what's going on at Harbor Place and other sites across the state. These are all important ingredients to starting to address some of the broader social issues that people are struggling from. So I'll leave it there and focus on any questions you have from here on out.
Thank you, Tim. Open for questions.
I could just keep talking.
I have a question.
Oh.
So you were here last year, and what stuck with me was the blob metaphor.
Thank you.
I'm also an Atlanta Falcons fan, so the score that you put up there also stuck with me quite well. That being said, can you give some updates or speak to how it's going with healthcare and then how it affects the work that we do there?
Sure. To summarize, last year I said that healthcare spending in Vermont is like the blob. For those of you who have seen the Steve McQueen movie from the 60s, the blob consumes everything in its path, and even the Barney Fife-like cop goes up to poke it with a stick, it eats him. It's an amazing movie. So, over the last 10 years or so, not only Vermont state government, but state governments all over the country have really been in starvation mode, right? There's, while salary costs and the types of expenses like contracted services, some of you may know something about, have all more or less been flatlined. The need has not. But one of the primary reasons why that's happening is because healthcare spending is eating up almost everything in the economy. Since 2000 to today, Vermont's overall healthcare spending, public and private sources, has gone from something like $2 billion a year to $6 billion a year. $6 billion is roughly the size of the entire state budget, including transportation and education. So that said, what good news might there be? I think I'll give more of an update than necessarily a prediction of good news, which is that there are a number of jargony-sounding healthcare terms that you will hear from time to time coming from the Green Mountain Care Board. The primary one is called the all-payer model. You don't have to worry about what that means or the fact that it's actually not an all-payer model, it's a some-payer model. Those are details for others to worry about. The concept, though, is that instead of paying a provider, whether it's a hospital or an independent doctor, on a per-episode basis, you know, every time I go in with a case of the sniffles, I have to pay a bill, rather to say, okay, Dr. X or Hospital X, you're responsible for this group of 20,000 people. Here's how much money we think it should cost to just make them okay, to treat those people's needs and to have a healthy community. By doing it that way, you're not incentivizing the X-ray, the constant X-rays and MRIs and all that stuff. You're actually incentivizing them to get you healthier faster. The idea then is that you give a block payment basically with a steady growth rate that's predictable so the providers can build around it, and it takes a lot of the volatility out. So that's the promise. I mean, that's the vision. It's part of a national movement of paying outcome-based payments and things like that. It's a transition we're in, though, because you don't just go from the old way of a $6 billion economy to this new, smarter vision overnight. It takes a lot of getting there. Most patients don't know they're part of this program, but they are in Vermont. And they shouldn't know it, right? It should be seamless for the actual human being. But we hope this will slowly rein in the growth rate in spending, and that's probably the level of depth I should get in at this moment, unless someone wants to. You'll need treatment after I finish if I keep going.
If anyone has, we have time for one more question.
Two more.
Going back to Bethany, on the red flag law, do you see a role for housing providers and case managers when they have a tenant or a client who's having a really hard time, has made it known that they have guns, but isn't quite at the place where they're going to be involuntarily hospitalized?
Yeah, so it's a very good question, because a red flag law, which, just to refresh, is when someone is exhibiting behaviors or saying things or doing things that make someone reasonably believe that they might be about to commit harm to someone else or themselves. A housing organization will often be the most likely group of individuals who would observe this behavior for the segment of people who live in group housing of some sort. And so obviously there's the sticky wicket of not looking like a bunch of narcs who are on the lookout for your own tenants. I mean, they deserve to live an independent life without being kind of monitored constantly. But not unlike the Ashe program, which many of you are familiar with, which is having people who are on the ground be the eyes and ears and the early detectors of signs of trouble, this should be no different. I think this is where it always flitters away in a discussion, is that it's basically a case-by-case basis, though, because if you're the Randolph housing group and you have a SASH coordinator who says, oh gosh, Mrs. Jones has said the following things, I'm very worried. Down in Bennington, the housing provider, the same exact facts may be viewed in a very different light, and they may treat it differently. So I think there's probably some education to be done, and I think the best person, and it might be for a future meeting like this, would be Brian Grierson, who is the chief administrative judge, which basically means he's the judge of judges. He coordinates all the judges in the state. He's a former judge himself. But it's a very good question because, it's kind of like medical services. Most human beings spend 99% of their time at home, not at the hospital, and yet our entire healthcare system is based on the hospital and not your home. And so in this case, the public safety focus, it makes sense the houser has some role. But I do think a training from the chief judge would probably be a very good use of this group's time.
So I'm Elizabeth Bridgewater from the Women's Housing Trust, and first I just want to thank you for the housing bond, for bringing more resources to Vermont, and our Great River Terrace project, which we're highlighting today, was the first project I think that was completed with bond funding. But my question is about the future and the fact that the payment on the bond is coming out of VHCB's annual allocation, and I'm curious if what your thoughts are about committing to a permanent source of funding for that debt service, so that we don't get a big ouch down the road in funding for housing development.
So it's a good question. So the annual costs of the housing bond are effectively being deducted from the VHCB annual appropriation. I'm not going to punt the answer, but I will say that depending on if the current governor is the governor next year, depends a lot on his attitude towards what to do about this question. When the housing bond was being debated, one of the problems was everyone liked the spending. Very few people wanted to pony up the money for it. So the administration opposed all new revenues. So that was just not happening. The only way you could then come up with the money was to cannibalize someone else. And so we didn't have a lot of volunteers saying, cut, $1.5 million for me on an annual basis. And so when we tried to link it to the property transfer tax, The water quality people said we were raiding their money, right? And so I think the governor has to signal whether there's another source. But here's my worry. I mean, so next year, I've already, you can kind of see the future sometimes. Next year, the proposal is probably going to emerge to not, once again, possibly fire thousands of teachers, which will disproportionately impact the people you serve, right? Younger families, people without many resources. The people who will get fired are more likely to benefit them than they will people with lots of resources. There'll be another attempt to gut, change, eliminate, privatize Efficiency Vermont, who most of you who have worked with at some level providing technical assistance or financial support. And it will be to try to undercut the current pension system for state employees and go to what is called a defined contribution instead of a defined benefit, playing the public against public employees who right now have the old-fashioned version of a pension, which is you know what you're going to get. So none of those things bode well for a discussion about like how to replace the VHCB money with another one. But if the governor comes in with a different mindset, it puts a lot more stuff on the table. So it's I don't know, I hate to give a political answer to the question, but it's what you got. One more question, and I like Ted squirming slightly as he looks at the clock.
You're in charge now.
Well, this is, another pie in the sky, but that, you speak to the cost of healthcare and to the all-care model, which is great, but if the savings is going to come from the housing and the services, when is that transition going to go, to answer this question, that if we can see the savings and measure the savings, why can't some of that support be?
Yeah, so it's a very good question, and a couple years ago, you may recall that almost every hospital in the state, not all, had excess revenue, which basically, it didn't mean they were they weren't necessarily ripping people off. It meant that more people were coming in and they were selling more health care, basically. Well, they then, as a result of that, had extra money. So a number of community organizations throughout the state were the lucky recipients of some of that money. So Champlain Housing Trust got a check, Howard Center got a check. Suddenly, we in the legislature were looking like the stingy people with no money to give, and UVM Medical Center looked like Santa Claus with a basket full of goods. So the question you ask really says, all right, if it is the work that many of you are doing, which is actually going to help reduce healthcare utilization, how come you guys don't get to share some of the spoils? And I think that is precisely the question. So to the credit of people like John Brumstead, who runs UVM Medical Center, and the other providers, they're all looking to think about how total spending on human needs gets looked at in a different, expanding the definition really of what it is so that your work gets rewarded. One of the great problems with a hospital-based system, including the all-payer model, is the first people in always get the best rewards. So they get the first cash prizes, and then everyone else is fighting for it. So I think, though, that the culture has changed, and I think many of those individuals who helped orchestrate this system are now seeing the benefits that can be mutually enjoyed. It will require, though, I'll just confess, I feel weird because I'm in Montpelier. I'm probably the most pugilistic with my own hospital, even though they're the largest employer in my district, because they also have a budget of $1.3 billion, which makes our general fund roughly comparable. But it will require people in this room to fight for some of those resources. Because state government, if the governor keeps saying his the slogans, no new this, no new that, well, that's fine if you're just in the House and Senate appropriations rooms. Walk to the Green Mountain Care Board, and they're approving tens of millions of dollars in new healthcare spending. So you guys need to be saying, whoa, 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 where's my piece of that for our work? The worst outcome would be you guys do more coordinated and better service delivery, make someone healthier and less likely to do an emergency room visit or whatever, and then someone else gets the reward for all of it, while you continue to not be able to give raises to your employees, have to cut back on healthcare benefits, and so on. I think you get the gist of it. So it will require perhaps some more outspoken, tense, but collegial discussions than we've seen in the past between outside agencies in our hospitals. So with that, thank you. I hope that was, I don't think it was that dark. There was a moment, but thank you for all the great work you do. I mean, it really, it is sometimes those of us in the legislature who feel like we're besieged with requests for funds and stuff, it's hard to step back and say, in total, can we be proud of what we're doing? And I think the takeaway from the Vermont Senate right now is we are very proud of all the efforts of the groups that are in the room, and we know that we have a great deficit that needs to be solved on the human level. And so we're committed to continuing to work with you on that. So thank you, guys.
Thank you, Jim. Okay, our next guest speaker is House Speaker Mitzi Johnson. Mitzi here. Please come forward, Madam Speaker. Do you want this?
Would you like me to have it?
No.
Okay, I'm always concerned about the people in the room in the back. So, you know, give me the sign if you can't hear me. I would be happy to use it. Thank you for having me, and most of all, thank you for all of the incredible work that you do around our state to provide such an amazing foundation for, for the core of Vermont. I tend to think of legislative issues in terms of the kind of category of things that affect a fairly isolated group, or separate those from kind of the keystone issues where you make a difference on this problem and it has all these other ripple effects. And I feel like housing and addiction are two of those big issues where when you can make progress on those two issues in particular, you start seeing so many other benefits ripple out into the community. Given I heard a good chunk of what Tim had to say, and he was pretty darn thorough. So I'm not sure if you need some of the same information over again, and while he's still in the room, I won't ask you if anybody was sleeping through his presentation. I was not.
Earhart made sure no one fell asleep. He timed his phone to alarms. Sorry.
It's handy that way.
Wake up call.
So what is, Tim gave a really great overview of all of the many ways that we've tried to create a little bit of an impact, and some of the ways that we've been successful with your help, such as the housing bond, which, as you well know, creates $110 million of construction and housing activity out in your communities, to some of the supports for low-income folks, as well as some of the things that we tried to do that got vetoed, such as minimum wage or paid family leave, that would really provide, I think, a much stronger future for a lot of the folks that you serve. And so we will keep working on some of those, and with problems as big as safe, affordable housing and plenty of it, we're not going to get to solution in our lifetimes, but we will get to progress, and hopefully significant amounts of it. So I'm not sure if there's a place that you would like me to start, rather than I had a very similar list in my head to that which he gave.
So some questions? Questions for the speaker?
So I'll ask the question that was asked to Tim, and that is, do you have ideas on permanent financing for the revenue bond as we go forward that would be less impactful on VHC's funding?
So yes, that's actually something that I spoke with Earhart about. That was one of my main concerns about that moving forward, and I think I talked about it last year when I was here. And it's one of those political decisions that you make going, oh gosh, do I grab the bird in the hand or the, and I think I stand by the decision of trying to get that bond out there and get more housing and put that flush of construction activity into the market. But in my mind, that's never been a, okay, check, done. It's been a, okay, step one. Now we have to figure out how to do that backfilling. We have, and a piece of it was backfilled. So that's a piece I helped to negotiate at the time. The governor's original proposal had the whole, so I'm sure you're all very familiar, just like, a mortgage where you get a slug of money so that you can buy a house, and then you have to pay it monthly for 30 years. In this case, we had generated a slug of money that we then have to, basically pay our mortgage for 20, 30 years on this bond. The governor's budget had the whole amount coming out of VHCB, and we negotiated half of that to be paid elsewhere through the property transfer tax. And yep, water quality people were upset at first, but then we put an extension on that. So they end up getting a little bit more over a 10-year period, and VHCB ends up getting a little bit more than they would have over the lifetime of the bond. But there is still some money to make up there, and I want to be clear that that's not the only money to make up for VHCB, because as the housing history buffs among you will remember, the property transfer tax was supposed to, be entirely funding conservation and affordable housing efforts, and so much of that has been siphoned off over the years and redirected to other things. And so, working on inching that up as well, just the base appropriation, not just the $1 million to make up for the remainder of the bond, but I'm forgetting the exact amount, but it's something in the order of, 15 to 20 million? That is the other property transfer tax that gets siphoned off.
The total amount that should have gone to VHCB this year was about 20.5 million. Gus can correct me if I'm wrong. And the transfer tax and capital dollars that went to VHCB was about 15.3 million. So it's about 4 to 5 million roughly got siphoned off this year.
So, so working on that issue as well. The whole concept of the property transfer tax, when it was developed, was a recognition of kind of the inverse relationship between the sale prices of homes and land and the availability of affordable housing, or the protections that conserved land had. I'm not talking about development right protection, I'm just talking about kind of market pressures. And so it was I think a really graceful acknowledgement of that, so that as property sold for more money would be available for affordable housing and conservation. And it's a model that other states have looked into, and we've led the country in. And so I think, do I have specific ideas for which types of taxes? There are all kinds of potential revenue sources, and frankly, it's a matter of creating that link, like the motel tax, the bed tax that you've proposed in the past, or or just finding general fund money for some of those other things that are using some of the property transfer tax. There's some economic development money in that property transfer tax now. There's, there's the water quality money. So, or it's just a matter of general fund. It's not, I think what a lot of people don't understand is that it's not about necessarily about like finding the specific tax and naming the exact revenue source. It's about creating the pressure for prioritization. I mean, you will hear from from a lot of folks in Montpelier that, oh, we don't have the money. And I say this very carefully as the former chair of the budget writing committee. We do have money. We have quite a lot of money. We have, $5.7 billion of public money. It's just all invested in other things. So by saying, what does Vermont need right now? How can we make the biggest difference? How can we have the most impact on creating the state that is our vision? It's that prioritization that frees up the money. And Tim alluded to this as well with the, with the attitude that the governor has taken on mostly no new taxes and fees. There have been a few that he's allowed. We have to work on prioritizing that piece. Not to say that the legislature can't pass them. The legislature did pass bills that raised money that were then vetoed, and then we have to ask ourselves: is it the political fight and making a point, or is it progress that we want? And we need some of each so that Vermonters have a chance to really weigh in on the conversation. Yes.
Thank you for bringing up in the beginning when you started to talk about your two topics, and one is addiction. And I just wanted to put it out there. I work for a nonprofit housing agency and the Opiate Coordination Council, but as public housing authorities, a group of us are really, we're seeing the effects of substance use disorder obviously in our communities and wanting to provide a rapid response as community development agencies and housers. So I'm just sort of putting that out there now that we are putting together some recommendations. One of the many happens to be recovery housing, more options for folks who are looking for sober living, and that's only one thing. Retention for our residents who are already in our affordable housing, how we can best get our services aligned, maybe a family SASH type of a program. So things are happening, and I just wanted to hear any thoughts about that.
I think those are great ideas. Let me know how I can help. One of my closest friends is an addiction psychiatrist up in St. Albans. And just hearing some of those HIPAA appropriate stories, and every now and then I get a text from her saying, hey, I've got a patient in this situation, is there somebody you can help us like find housing for this person or get veteran services or, and so it is a problem that feels crippling. It is so weighty, and it has such an effect on the services that children need in school, and a family's health and safety, and an individual's ability to thrive. It affects our business communities and their ability to hire employees, to make their businesses successful and grow. And as difficult as the problem feels in Vermont, I don't know if anybody saw, I think it was New York Times a few weeks ago, had some statistics out that Vermont is actually one of the bright spots. There were, 5 or 8 states in the country where overdose deaths had declined. In most states, overdose deaths from last year to this year have increased, and Vermont is one of the few places that they have declined. And so leaves me with mixed feelings, like, okay, yay, we're doing something right. We might not know exactly which piece we're doing is correct, but let's just keep working on that. But it also makes me incredibly worried that what we're seeing is the good news. And so I think being able to, whatever we can, to treat the problem holistically. And, we can't, you can't punish your way out of addiction. You can't just hand somebody a pamphlet and say, good luck with that. There needs to be a lot of wraparound supports, and I think one of the most powerful stories, and really community building, that Ashe model where you're really coming in and supporting somebody at home, and there's somebody there that can see these different pieces. My friend told me about one of her patients who came in and, said that she slipped up that week, that an old friend or an ex, somebody that she had used with, had sort of come back in town and, come on, Ted, just for old time's sake, come on, let's. And she slipped up, and so my friend wrote her a prescription for love and support, and she wrote her this prescription that said, you deserve the life that you're trying to create, and I, so-and-so's doctor, am prescribing to her friends and family, to, so-and-so's friends and family, that they support her decision and help her make the right choices, and, and help her build the future she wants. And she handed it to the person as a reminder, and the patient actually taped it to her front door. And when she's, it's a signal to anybody coming into her home, coming into her life, that that's what she's trying to do. And when she doesn't feel that she has the strength, on her own shoulders to in a moment of choice, she has her trusted doctor to fall back on, to say, no, see, here, this is a prescription for you, my friends and family. This is what I need. And so whatever we can do to systematize that kind of support, I think is incredibly important.
I'd just like to say that's a beautiful story, and I think it really builds on a lot of what we're seeing in the housing world, is that we need to partner services with housing supports, and there's a lot of, and that those services need to include well-being, including building permanent connections. And I work with youth populations, and we know that's a well-established piece of youth populations, but I think it needs to be a model that is translated into the adult service world as well. That we are really, when we're thinking about case management along with housing supports, that those include things like looking at, does this person have permanent connections in their community? Do they know what resources are available to them? Do they have access to normalization activities that make them feel like a real human being? And so I think that when we talk about what is needed for the housing stock a lot, we can't forget that companion services need to be funded as well. And so I'll just put that we should always be looking at a partnership between those two pieces. And I think there's been a lot of work to build up housing stock in the state, and service providers are struggling to keep up with the increased capacity needs on services. So as we move forward with funding in the state, it'd be great to just maintain a balance between those two pieces.
Thank you for reminding me of that. And I know some of those pieces can get and are going to get trickier and more difficult in terms of funding, as are some of our funding mechanisms with the federal government, our partnerships with the federal government on funding certain services change. I won't go into the details, but for those of you to whom this means something, with our global commitment waiver having been renegotiated and some things getting crossed off the list that we can pay for with
Yeah,
blended
it's
state
problematic.
federal dollars, it is hugely problematic, and it, it's one of those, like, wait, we should know which stuff is most effective,
Right.
and work to fund the things that are actually going to work. Like, what a concept.
And I think it's where we can build that bridge to prevention, right? Like,
Yeah.
we're always trying to move upstream, and I think in infusing those services into housing, it allows us to create long-term solutions and allows people to be more sustainable and reduce the need for chronic support.
Yeah, well, and in so many different places, in the addiction world, in the world of developmental disabilities, in the aging world, and even in the low-income world of intergenerational poverty, where there aren't necessarily those role models and somebody doesn't know how to get up. I had a, experience this winter with my mother-in-law. I lovingly called her my lawless mother. I was the lawless daughter. Seemed to work. And just as she was declining, finding ways to support her in a rural place where there wasn't anybody. There are agencies, and I had a really hard time, and I kept, finding just availability of people that could be with her in Grand Isle, and that's commuting distance from Burlington. That's not the Kingdom. And I just kept thinking, man, I feel like I know about most programs that or I have access to an awful lot of information. If I can't figure this out for my family member, how do other people do this? It is a tremendous problem, and it feeds into some of what Tim touched on with the wages that frontline workers are paid, and they get their foot in the door, and they get poached by other agencies, and then the people that need the most stability in their interface are constantly getting a new person, and a lot of people, just can't tolerate that. They can't thrive in that situation.
We should probably move on. Thank you,
Okay.
Madam Speaker, for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Next guest speaker is Mr. Gus Seelig, Executive Director of the Vermont Housing Conservation Board, and welcome.
And I guess I just wanted, Erhard asked me to report on how the housing revenue bond work was going. And before I do that, I just want to say a big thank you to everybody in this room. And Erhard, you changed the screen as you went under the table. Because the housing revenue bond would not have been possible without everybody's good work and advocacy, and really creating an atmosphere in which the legislature could consider it. And just as a sense of where the governor and the legislature came from, basically we've probably about tripled our housing effort and our housing dollars over a 2 to 3 year period because of the revenue bond. And that happened because you created the atmosphere in which people said this is really, really a high priority. So I'll report to you on what's happened so far. And I guess I just, as we get going, want to say that the governor deserves our thanks because he went out and did something other Republican governors might not have ever even thought about doing. And he trusted all of you to help deliver the goods. And we got an awful lot of help both from the speaker and the pro tem along the way to make the revenue bond happen. And if you're looking for your own legislators to thank, some of the key folks were Helen Head, Tom Stevens, Becca Ballant, Michael Sirotkin. Many others contributed along the way, but those people really did the heavy lifting. And it was not a straight, easy line, oh, everybody agrees upon this, let's get it done. There were a number of moments that it would have fallen apart. So, Erhard, you're just going to move them along. So just what does the law say? Act 85 says that we're going to spend a quarter of the housing, or target a quarter of the housing that we produce with a revenue bond, at least a quarter on people below 50% of median income. This is a little bit different because we've done this in our home ownership programs, but not our rental programs. Quarter of the housing is to be targeted to people who are above 80% of median and below 120. And I think as the governor was campaigning, he heard from employers all over the state that workforce housing was a problem. And of course, we all know that there's a lot of workforce housing needed for people below 50% of median. They're in the labor force, but particularly, and Chris Donnelly and CHT did a lot of work on this as they pulled together a coalition to produce more housing in Chittenden County. The development community and the business community was very much at the table saying, yeah, this is really, really important. The balance of the units can be targeted anywhere from the very lowest, most vulnerable Vermonters up to 120% of median. As we've looked at and we'll go to the next slide, what are some of the things we have to think about? Legislature is very concerned that we get these funds all over the state. We are all dealing with rising construction costs. While we have a whole lot more money in the state, we haven't had a big increase in any federal resources. We did get some increase in the low-income housing tax credit this year. But beyond that, our federal partners, we need to continue to push to the table. There is also an ongoing need for preservation, and I just need to say to you, as we worked on the revenue bond with the administration and the legislature, they said, yes, we want to use these funds to protect the vulnerable. Yes, we want to use these funds to produce more housing. Preservation, not so much a priority, though we did talk about a couple of really distressed preservation projects that we would be working on. And then down the road, when you get to fiscal year 20, if we don't, and I think this went to the question Andrew asked a few minutes ago, do some more good advocacy, housing funding is going to drop down back below the level that it was before the revenue bond, and we can talk more about that in a few minutes. So what's happened? This is the recently completed Great River Terrace project in Brattleboro, a partnership between Groundworks Collaborative and the Wyndham Windsor Housing Trust. 22 new units. Everybody is getting into this through the coordinated entry system, and half the units are specifically for people who have been homeless, but not everybody will be at the highest end of that need. The project has been able to patch together 100% rental assistance. And just to go to the next slide, this is the Wilson Block in Springfield. It's been vacant for more than a decade. It's right in the center of town. So a real drag on a struggling community. 4 of the apartments here will go to homeless youth, and there'll be some programming around that as well. One of the things you all have worked on is the issue of the governor's executive order on homelessness. And so just here's the results as we count them at 2018 with the folks we regularly work with. And there's been a great uptick in the percentage of housing being made available that we've funded for the homeless. We're up over the 15% on a statewide basis. There are parts of the state that we still have a ways to go. But I think the bigger news, and this goes to the work all of you do at the community level, really is about the turnover and the cooperation at the local level. So of the 1,100 apartments that turned over last year, more than 300, about 28% went to folks who had been experiencing homelessness. So we think that's moving where we need to move. We also continue to, in terms of helping vulnerable Vermonters, most of you know the Vermont Center for Independent Living has a home access program. The waiting list has been getting longer, so there's a $600,000 allocation to them to chop into that waiting list. Their annual funding is usually in the $500,000 range, so they'll be working at a more aggressive pace on that. This is White River Junction, and I'm sure the governor came and visited about 6 weeks ago when the foundation was in. I'm sure we're further along in the construction, but if there's a place in Vermont outside of Chittenden County Where we really have an extraordinary shortage of housing, it would be in the Upper Valley. And that's Sue Cobb from Housing Vermont educating the governor about construction. One of the projects that got held up in the court system, NIMBY fight, is Monument View in Bennington. It's now under construction. But in the 3 years over the court fight, the costs, of course, went up. So the revenue bond helped to fill the gap, and that's now well underway and should be occupied in the spring. We're often asked, why doesn't the private sector do all this good work? And this is the proposed transit center in Montpelier that's been in the works since 1992, right, Allison? And there was a private developer who was going to build housing above the transit center, and last year they backed out, so they couldn't make the numbers work. So Downstreet and Housing Vermont came to the rescue, and again, there will be 30 mixed-income apartments. There's another 19 that'll come online, not from the revenue bond, but on Main Street above Aubuchon's, that will come online this fall. So for Montpelier, just about 50 new units of housing in a short period of time. South Burlington City Center, this is a community that's done a huge amount of planning. And Cindy's going to have to tell me whether this is the building that's up or a drawing of the picture that's about to go up.
It's up and almost done. It's called Allard Square.
Allard Square. And there's another project breaking ground not far from here. And this is really interesting. You wouldn't have known it until the trees came down, but this is just a stone's throw from, and the other development from the school, and the city is putting in City Hall and a library right next door. So they really are, a suburban community really is creating a city center, which is very exciting, and there'll be hundreds more units. On the home ownership side, CHT has these buildings at 40th and Allen, and they will be converted to condominiums that will sell for between $120,000 and $160,000, which is a great deal in that market. This is, for us, something we've been working on for a number of years. This is the Burlington College site, and this is what an architect thinks it'll look like when it's all built out. There's a couple things important about this development. One is that there's 12 acres that have been transferred to the city as a public park. Second, Burlington for many years has had inclusionary zoning. And back when we funded, you ask about why do we have these dual goals, we funded a project with the city of Burlington back around 1990 to buy a chunk of the waterfront. I think that's where the concerts were this weekend, the Grace Potter show. But in the context of all that discussion, the city agreed that a quarter of any housing on the waterfront was going to be affordable housing and put in place inclusionary zoning and ordinances. So when this opportunity came up, working with a private developer, Eric Farrell, the plan is for about a quarter of the housing here to be affordable to a range of incomes from the very lowest up into luxury housing that the private developer will do. We won't obviously be involved in those, but folks will have access to a public park and lots of amenities here. And the first two projects have been funded, and we expect a third on this site with Cathedral Square to come to us and be funded in this winter. Downtowns, when we get done with the revenue bond, we will have hit a number of major downtowns. The drawing below, there'll be a groundbreaking in a few weeks on Flat Street in Brattleboro, next to their transit center. And then in the upper picture is the Putnam Block in downtown Bennington, right at the junction of Routes 7 and 9. The upper floors I toured last spring have been vacant for more than 40 years. And a 2-acre parcel was assembled by the local economic development group. The project was in some difficulty, and we convinced the community, working with Housing Vermont and Shires, that if they would pledge another 30 units of affordable housing down the road, that they could help get the private investment through Housing Vermont that they needed to make this deal go. So this is 80 to 120% of median in the first phase of about 20 units of housing. But the future phase will have another 30 units of permanent affordable housing coming down at us. One of the projects we talked about when we were in the campaign mode in the legislature is this building in downtown St. Johnsbury. There's about 10,000 square feet of vacant commercial space that's been vacant for more than a decade. For those of you from the Upper Valley who know the legacy of Armory Square in Windsor, same out-of-state owner who extracted as much profit as he could. He had a Section 8 contract there, and about beginning of the summer, Housing Vermont closed and purchased this, and we expect it to come in for redevelopment. For those from the St. Johnsbury area, there's been an ugly bed bug infestation that's been going on for about 4 years. So their first big investment was to deal with the bed bugs at a cost well over, I think, $40,000. So this next slide tells you what's been done so far. The first 86 homes will be occupied by November. So remember, this just got passed a year ago, June, so people have really been pushing to get stuff done. About a third of the housing that has been funded so far is going to be affordable at 50% of median and below. We're a little short right now on the targeted housing for people between 80 and 120% of median. So we'll be working on that as well, and hopefully do some more home ownership along the way. If our board says yes this week, and they're considering 4 more projects that are, what, Martin, another 50 or so units of housing?
Yes.
So we're going to be well past the halfway point in spending the revenue bond. We think by the time we get to the next fiscal year, we'll be down below about $6 million that will be left available to spend. Lots of good projects. In terms of some of the discussion you've had up to now, our board is also going to consider a request from Cathedral Square to experiment with extending the SASH model to families. When it meets on Thursday, we also have a request from Down Street to begin some planning work for recovery housing, and I hope before we're done with the bond, we actually fund some recovery housing. So this last slide is the groundbreaking at Allard Square, and Cindy will tell you the lady in the middle is Mrs. Allard, who is the longest standing resident at 3 Cathedral Square.
Yes, 39 years.
Yeah, so this building is being named for her, and I think it just speaks. We often think about our housing as what do we do this year, but a public investment was made 39 years ago, and this lady has been able to live in dignity all those years and been a great member of the 3 Cathedral community and is still with us and inspiring us. I guess the last thing I just want to comment on, and I'm happy to answer any questions about the revenue bond. I really appreciate all the things that our pro tem and our speaker had to say today. But one point of just disagreement, I'm somebody who is old enough to remember when Vermont didn't need a shelter system. So I don't think it's acceptable to say we're never going to solve this problem. We don't have the political will right now to solve it, but it will take everybody in this room insisting that we must solve it to get to the place where that doesn't become part of our discussion, as it won't get done in our lifetimes. In my lifetime, we lived without needing a shelter system. I hope we can get there again. We're going to need all of your help as the revenue bond gets spent down to keep our housing budget back up. And I guess my last comment, just for those of you who were try to simplify down the speaker's discussion of the property transfer tax. Back in 1987, when we created the Housing and Conservation Board, real estate was going up like a rocket, 1% a month for a couple of years, 2% for shoreline. What the legislature decided was the transfer tax was a great indicator of distress in the marketplace. When properties are being flipped, it means people are being displaced from their communities. People are being displaced from land. Public access gets limited. So they didn't just say, here's a funding source that'll raise money. They said, this is a great barometer for the need to invest in housing. And as Earhart said, that transfer tax this year, our share of it should be about $21 million. We're actually receiving about $10 million from that place another 6 million, 5.5 million from the capital budget. So there is room for legislators to do more. And if you let them know that you're concerned, and the best time to get a hold of them and get their attention is between now and Election Day. This is when they're all paying attention. So please chat with them about the good work all of you are doing all over the state, the partnerships that are being formed, the housing that's getting built, and the folks that are going to be able to live in dignity because of your good work. And thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Not much priority was being placed on that. What exactly did you mean by that, and what are you referring to?
Well, for instance, we have experienced over time the loss of some Section 8 housing that we invested in many years ago. We also have seen in neighborhoods where there's a lot of upward pressure, losing housing that working people of modest means have lived in. When we sold the housing bond to the governor and the legislature, they were very clear. They wanted to add units. They were not looking for preservation projects, with the exception of one like the one I showed you in St. Johnsbury, where we had a clearly distressed community asset that was dragging the whole downtown down, was lousy housing, where there can be some kind of real economic stimulus out of that. So we are, with our base appropriation, still funding some preservation work, but it's not nearly the priority that it has been in some other times. And I think that speaks to some of the places across the state where we really just have a shortage of units, shortage of homes, and until we get ahead of that or get even with that, prices go up and people get priced out of the market. So I think that's the intention, and it's a great intention. For those of you who know John Davis, he says there's 3 Ps to affordable housing: protect the vulnerable, preserve what you have, and produce more. We're focused with this funding on 2 of those 3. In another time, we'll get back to preservation. Anything else, or do you want to get on with your agenda? Thanks for the good work all of you do every day. Thank you.
Josh and I agreed to make one little change here at this point and let our guest, the Democratic nominee for governor, Christine Hallquist, come forward and make her presentation. You want that?
Sure. Yeah. And thank you, everybody. Thank you for all that you do. I'm going to talk about what I believe, what I know, what I think I know, and what I've heard. But first, let me start with a belief. If you look, if you look at the issues we have today, we've come a long way downhill to get where we are today, and when I travel the country, first of all, when I go to Burlington and I see the homelessness, my heart goes out to them. And there's this one particular woman who, I give $5 to every time I see. And she's a wonderful woman. And a couple weeks ago, when I gave her $5, she cried and said, I finally, for the first time, was able to afford to move into an apartment. So people are, I believe that people are homeless as a result of all the inaction that the rest of us haven't yet taken. The action, there's actions, they result in reaction. People don't just say, I'm going to be homeless the rest of my life. So let's talk about how we got here. And I especially like to point out to young people, because some of you might be as old as I am and be able to still remember things, which I'm lucky I can still remember things. But so if I go back, if you look what happened, it started with Richard Nixon, and then Ronald Reagan sealed the deal. It was really this attack on the working class. And if you look at the minimum wage, if it was adjusted for inflation today, it'd be $22 an hour. That's $44,000 a year. And most people in the late 60s got benefits. So you throw, $10 or $15,000 in benefits. The minimum wage was over $50,000 a year. And of course, I talked to the Housing Partnership. They say it takes a 2-bedroom unit, costs about $250,000. It takes $22 an hour to to support housing. So if people aren't making a living wage, and we are going to be a civilized society, then we have to subsidize housing. A plus B equals C. Now, the Republican Governors Association is going to attack me like crazy because Christine's going to raise taxes, it's the end of the world. And I may not get elected. Well, but I hope that enough people are rising up now to resist what's happening in order to change the direction of our future. So now let's talk about all the other issues that relate to housing from my perspective. Let's start with seniors. Seniors, I know that, we took my father-in-law in the house. He was for a year. We have a fairly small home. We were 3 kids, 3 bedrooms. Took my father-in-law in, and then he lived as long as he could in the house, and then we moved to Greensboro Nursing Home. And one of the things I know, and I talk to most elderly folks, they want to live in their homes. And of course, Medicare doesn't necessarily provide the benefits to allow people to continue to live in their homes. And of course, if people remain in their homes, that's probably the lowest cost type of housing, is just supporting people in their homes. So I think I talk about working with all the other states to change some of these Medicare rules. We'll form coalitions of states to change these things at the federal level, but that's something that needs to be addressed, of course. But then, of course, the other, as we work our way down from a living wage, I think of my daughter and her boyfriend who, worked very successful, both college educated, but still can't afford a house. They did manage to find a house, and of course, as parents, we supported them. But for most working class kids starting out, as I talk to housing partnerships, having, this shared mortgage and shared mortgage benefits is a very helpful program. And of course, we want to do that as much as possible. But then getting down to the people that just can't, afford homes at all, we do have to subsidize that. And it's certainly like the Housing for All revenue bonds is a way to address those issues. But I do think we also have to address the impact of the Vermont Housing Conservation Board's long-term budget. Because, ultimately, we're robbing Peter to pay Paul, right? We've got to figure out how to fund that long-term, because once bonds are great, they get started, but you got to pay them back. So working that, we have to figure out long-term how to, and I'll work with the legislature, how to make sure that we're not, degrading things in the future by paying the interest and the principal on those bonds. And then let's get back, let's get down to, to those folks that have substance use disorders, whatever those substances are. I believe in a housing first model for a variety of reasons. The housing, I was up in the Northwest Correctional Facility the other day, and they were talking about the difficulty of people who get out of prison, and they just, that they do drive them to drop them off in the streets of our towns, but there aren't places for those people to live. And sometimes people have substance use disorders, and of course you trace that back, it gets to some of the mental health issues that create those issues. So let's make sure we start focusing on housing first models, so regardless of your substance use disorder, you can live off the streets, because if you're living in a home, there's a greater opportunity. We're going to be able to get you the help you need in order to deal with your substance use disorders. And of course, let's fund the resources for helping people with their substance use disorders. And that's where I go back to, spent the afternoon with Grace Keller at the Howard Safe Recovery Center. The needle exchange was a place that Burlington struggled with. But Burlington, like other communities, had needles on the streets. 10 years ago, they were all over the streets. We put in a needle exchange and virtually eliminated needles on the streets. More importantly, however, we save, clean needles will avoid 6 heart valve transplants a year at a cost of $620,000 each. You take 6 times $620,000, you get $3.72 million. Her budget's only $420,000. We can throw a full-time nurse and support to get help with those and add another $200,000 to that budget and repeat that model throughout the state. And we're gonna save money in the long run. We're gonna help people with their substance use disorders, and make sure the housing all lines up with that. So to kind of get you in touch with how I'm thinking about the systemic way to attach these things. I see the great things that many of your groups are doing here, but I also recognize we've got to address some of the long-term budget issues to deal with that. So then the next question gets to, so you're just going to raise taxes. Now, we've got to grow our rural economy. If you look what's happening in rural Vermont, we're a microcosm of rural America, and I've spent the last 10 years working with rural America, and what we're seeing is increasing rates of poverty. We're seeing flights to the city. We're seeing an aging demographic. And so, the good leadership puts a business plan in place to change that. That's why I'm going to connect every home and business with fiber optic cable and use the tax increment financing model that's worked so well in St. Albans and White River, and happening now in Bennington with the Putnam Block in Springfield. We're going to use those models to rebuild our communities. So now you've got a great place for people to come and live and work. I mean, if you look at Vermont, we're the healthiest state, got the best education system. We're the safest state, and we've got amazing people that are as amazing as our business. Of course, we're going to be able to grow our rural economy. Put more food on the table, so we're not fighting over these scraps. So that's kind of that whole systemic thinking that I have going into leadership of this state. And yes, you will hear that I'm being criticized because I talk about changing the revenue equation, which could mean different levels of taxation for different folks and how we fund that. But I'm completely committed to work collaboratively with the legislature to get this done. But I start with the first belief. I say, this isn't politics that I'm talking about. A living wage, ending homelessness, and Medicare for all. That's called being a civilized society. Simple said. So I've got a few minutes for questions, if people have questions. Yes?
Specifically, last year, the last session, there was a proposal for a occupancy fee for motels and hotels. It was like $2. It's not very modest, and it would have been paid probably overwhelmingly by out-of-staters, like 90%. But because of the governor's threat to veto any new things like that, it just haven't got any legs in the legislature. Is that something you could support?
Yeah, and again, I'm going to be careful not to say specifically where the sources come from, because I think nobody likes to pay more for anything. In my 13 years as the CEO of electric utility, our members would constantly come up to me and say, when are our rates going to go down? I'd say, they're never going down. I want to make that very clear, because all the costs are rising. How do you expect to be immune for those rising costs? So this no new taxes is rhetoric, but I think it's uncivilized rhetoric, because again, what I'm saying is a civilized society will work towards a living wage, ending homelessness, and Medicare for all. So, yeah, we're going to figure out how to do these things together and collaboratively. And, if a user tax is the way to do that, of course. I'm starting with the whole point being the goal should be here. The goal should be to be a civilized state. And I will do what I can to get there. Now, I also have to recognize, anything we do, in my job, we served 18 to 25 poorest communities in Vermont. First measure is always economic justice. When I talk about growing the economy, we're going to measure it on how it impacts the bottom 20% on the economic ladder. Who cares? You hear this rhetoric, we got the economy's doing great this year. Yeah, but the working class is not seeing real increase in their wages. We're not seeing a way out of this poverty. I introduced a proposal the other day that we rolled out. First thing we're going to do is provide free college, in-state college for all those that are living below the poverty line. We have to create pathways out of poverty. And that's the obligation of a civilized society. So somehow, and again, that's where I go back to where it started, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, getting the idea that that all of us contributing our fair share to creating a civilized society has somehow become a bad thing. It's a good thing. So yes, the answer is yes. I would support whatever we can in order to help in the situation. Other questions? Yes.
On my case of private communities, Mitzi Johnson remarked that in our current revenue model, Vermont has $5.7 billion to be committed to our priorities. But we all have conflicting wants. Do you think that as a governor, the House, the Senate, can you be seen to be modeling a civilized discussion of shared needs and compromise rather than a competition for what you want and what powerful is?
Yeah, and I love that question. I think what you're talking about, there are some people that have a zero-sum mentality that believe that, your win is my loss. I know, I'm sitting here, at this age in life, looking back at my career, knowing it's always a win-win, and especially when you're talking about, and to answer that question about how we're competing resources, it is around us all figuring out together collaborative. That's why I believe in collaborative leadership, not command and control leadership. It's around when we pull together, we can do great things. But when we're fighting with each other, we go the other direction. So yes, it is about pulling together, deciding together what our priorities, not what my priorities are. But I'm going to start a constant drumbeat of that belief. The belief is we need to move towards a living wage. We need to get to improve Medicare for all, and we need to end homelessness. That's called being a civilized society, and everything should fall underneath that mantra and how we work together. So yes, of course, we will work together to try to achieve those common goals. And I look, it's overwhelming running for governor, looking at all the problems we have to deal with. But again, I have great faith that people pulling together, we can do great things. And I think that's my message. My message is somehow we've been in this doom and gloom spiral. We don't need to be there. The idea is, if you look at 2/3 of Vermonters live in rural Vermont. The greatest opportunity comes from those lowest performing areas. And everybody benefits. I tell people in Chittenden County, we grow rural Vermont, we will have more resources. That will take the pressure off your taxes. Again, am I ever committing to taxes go down? I'm not sure I would even think about saying that. But let's talk about achieving those higher level goals without putting a greater burden on the folks that can least expect that burden. So everything we should do, we should measure with the lens of how does it impact those people on the lowest economic ladder. So even when I talk about, people ask me about putting a price on carbon. Sure, the price on carbon is a great public policy, but we have to first test it through that measure of how does it impact those people living on the lowest rungs of the economic ladder. Because people are struggling today more than they ever have since we started measuring the history of economics in this country. We have the greatest separation of wealth we've ever seen. And what you're all working on here is a long-term result of a policy that's caused this to happen. So if a policy caused us to get here, a policy can cause us to get there. Question?
Sean Kelly.
Thank you, Southwest Madam Sean Kelly. I just had a quick question. I spent some time here in Randolph, Vermont, homeless person. Experienced a lot of things, and I noticed that while looking around and meeting new people, that a good percentage of our homeless community was veterans and people with mental illness. And the governor, I'm curious what he might do to help those to help the people in that particular bracket, the mental illness and the homeless veterans, and how do you allocate funds for the government to assist them?
Well, the question, I'll answer the question of mental illness and mental illness, I'll separate that from the veteran question. So if you look at you know, if you look at what the ACLU has a plan to bring our prisoners back to Vermont and cut the prison population in half. You know, we spend $73,000 a year to incarcerate prisoners. Now, you know, you're going to see the Republican Governors Association say, oh, Christian's going to let all these killers on the street. Well, that's fear. That's fear. You know, I went up to when I was at the Northwest Correctional Facility, a good percentage of those people that were in prison were there because they had mental health issues and they couldn't find any other place to put them. You go to the ER rooms, people show up with mental health issues, they get stuck in a room somewhere because we don't have the support for them. And that results in greater cost for us in the long term. So, of course, moving funding to the preventive side is going to be, it's called making good strategic investments. So, of course, making improvements on mental health funding will help us in the long term. For even those most conservative financial folks that don't have a heart, it's a good investment because it'll save money in the long term. And of course, we should take care of veterans. And again, taking care of veterans, we need to take care of everybody, including veterans. Other questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Sandy Parrots from Vermont Legal Aid. I hear you saying pretty clearly that you will support raising the minimum wage. I'm wondering what you think that should look like. Should it be what was proposed last session, $15 an hour by 2022 or something else? And I'm also wondering whether you support big family.
What was the last, support the last? Oh, yeah, so you know, that bill that was vetoed by the governor, I would ask to be brought back as quickly as possible and sign it. That was well thought out. Again, if you look, for me, I've been a collaborative leader. The last thing you do as a leader is you know, you have people work on these things long and hard and then say no. You know, that's very patriarchal, and it just takes the wind out of everybody's sails. People work really hard and thought very hard to come up with that minimum wage bill. I attended some of those hearings. This wasn't just randomly chosen. It was a lot of hard work to come up with that compromise that got us to where we were. It's clearly not enough because it doesn't get us to a living wage, and we have to continue to improve it. But that should be put in place right away, and I would also sign the family leave bill, bring that back as quickly as possible. Because, you know, again, it all ties together. Even when it comes to the school issues, you think about closing some of these rural schools, you've got parents that are working 3 jobs. Now their kids have to be 2 hours on a school bus. And, you know, I'll tell you my own story. You know, my oldest son was a non-traditional learner. He did film. He's very successful today. But I don't think he would be, he'll tell you this. You know, we're not sure where he would have ended up if I wasn't close to the school. You know, he came into the school and said, this is Green Mountain Technology Center, says, I want to do film. They said, they don't have a film program. They said, well, if you can find a teacher, and he found a teacher, a wonderful woman, and he got 2 other students, and I gave this teacher my card. I said, that has my pager number, because knowing these 3 kids, you're going to need to call me at times. And sure enough, she would call me. Oh my God, they're out of control. All right, I'll be right there. 12 minutes away, I'm able to go there, pull the kids aside, say, kids, you want to do film? You behave. And it worked. But the point is, you know, that all ties together. Think about that poverty. Think about my son, who's doing very well today, could easily be homeless. It's those decisions that we have to think about. That's why I'm committed to signing those bills, and committed at the highest level to this belief that we need to be civilized. Other questions or thoughts?
One more?
Yep, one more.
Thank you.
Oh,
another question. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Brittany Nichols from Brattleboro. I'm a person who has lived experience with homelessness and also has subsidized housing now. And when Governor Sheldon was still governor, we were involved with this poverty council. And I was very disappointed to find out when we changed it, we had a change in governorship, but nothing was done with this 5-year project, which is very important, I feel. And there's important parts of that that we were not aware of that should come in with.
Okay, I will. Thank you. So thank you for having me.
you, Ms. Hallquist. So we agreed, Josh and I agreed that he would start facilitating at this point in the meeting, and so I'll turn it over to him.
Thanks, Ted. We're also presenting, so I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Josh Davis from Groundworks, along with...
I am Elizabeth Bridgewater from the Wyndham and Windsor Housing Trust.
Sure.
Okay, so we are excited to present our collaboration with Great River Terrace, which is in North Brattleboro, right on Route 5. Before I start, I just want to thank the folks that helped make this project possible, that are outside this collaboration, and specifically I want to thank Senator Rebecca Ballant. We're very lucky to have her in our community, and the work that she did on the housing revenue bond. This project, a lot of you probably already know this metaphor, described as a three-legged stool. It has three components: affordable housing apartments, deep subsidies for the residents themselves that help pay for the rent so that it can be at a level that they can afford, and then the supportive services component that is in collaboration with Groundworks Collaborative and Healthcare and Rehabilitation Services. So we chose two partners. We're following an evidence-based model of housing first, and so there aren't any real barriers for people when they apply for housing. I think there's two barriers, and that was that folks can't be on the long-term sex offender list, and they can't have been convicted of blowing up a house or an apartment due to a meth lab production operation. Pardon?
I said slime house.
So, yeah, we can't waste it. But other than that, so the barrier is pretty low to access these apartments. The other key component is that services are voluntary. So we've got supportive services right on site with the community center that we built as part of the development. And Groundworks Collaborative has a case manager right on site full-time. HCRS has a case manager there part-time. And then we hired a housing support coordinator who's there full-time. So there's three people on site all the time. And really the goal is to build relationships, culture, and that sense of support that's available right outside their door, so that when that moment comes where folks feel like they need help, it's right there, ready to go. But it's not mandatory, and that's one of the key components. So I'm going to we're going to go back and forth, and Josh is going to, actually before I go to the next slide, let me just say this project started with Connie Snow. Many of you have known Connie for many years, my predecessor. And, it really was her fearlessness. It's one of the things I loved about Connie, is she was very fearless in looking ahead. And there were a lot of things that were not in place when she made the decision to go for the purchase of this old motel building that became Great River Terrace. She didn't know where the deep subsidies were going to come from. We didn't know how the partnerships were going to form. But she was committed to this vision and took a lot of risk. And we'll talk about what mitigates that risk as we go through the presentation. But I just want to bring her into the room because this really wouldn't have happened without her fearlessness. And so I just want to thank Connie once more.
Absolutely. And on the next slide, you can see how this project came along. It really took roots in 2014. Myself and Connie went down to Connecticut along with Sarah Carpenter and Pauline Nichols to visit some permanent supportive housing sites in Connecticut. And I think it's really fascinating to see what they've done with housing in Connecticut. It's only a couple states away, but they took a completely different tact. And years ago, they started investing in permanent supportive housing projects as opposed to the emergency shelter system. So it's one of the few places that you can look at that has long-term evidence of what happens when you invest in permanent supportive housing. And I would have to say that on that trip, we looked at 3 or 4 different types of housing units, and really the combination of that lit a fire for the idea of having a permanent supportive housing project in Brattleboro. That was further fueled in 2016 when a group of local agencies attended the Corporation for Supportive Housing National Conference in Chicago. Really, they were pumping permanent supportive housing as well. But also this idea of this being a collaboration. And I think something that is great about this project is both the collaboration between the social service agencies, but also the focus of making this a community and not just bricks and mortar housing. And so again, the germination of this relationship and team building began at that conference in Chicago. And really it was on the heels of that conference that we started to gain some momentum and started planning for what was to become Great River Terrace. We really met intently once we had a project and funding is getting in place and it's looking like this is going to happen. We started meeting regularly and actually had multiple meetings per month with different subgroups that were working through the dynamics, what are our different agencies' philosophies, how are we going to work with tenants on that, how are we going to work together, what does communication look like, what are roles and responsibilities, what's the vision of this? So we really worked through methodically all of these different questions and more, and then started hiring staff. And you can see up there it says hiring staff together. I think we all set in on each other's hiring process when we were bringing people onto the team. It was really important to have that collaboration at the core. Now that planning group is an advisory committee, and the service team is really doing the heavy lifting since the facility opened up, the community opened up. And we are just about leased up.
We're leased up.
We are fully leased up. And so we're ahead of schedule, and thanks to the good work of that team.
So Great River Terrace today is 22 micro apartments. They range from 385 square feet to 450 square feet with what we're calling a key holders apartment that's in the 500 square foot range. They are a mix of studios and one bedrooms. And it's interesting when you build that type of apartment from scratch, how much efficiency you can get. And I kind of think of it as sort of a ship where every bit of space has been planned in order to facilitate storage and the use of a small space. And so it's quite it's a lovely place for folks to live. This is our funding stack. You can see it's a lot of sources, and that was kind of part of the challenge because we went for 4% tax credits, which is the program that brings in less capital than the 9% program, so we had to augment with other funding sources. Thank God the National Housing Trust Fund had just been funded, and we were one of the first projects in the country to have funds allocated to a project, and we have Senator Sanders to thank for that. He, as Gus said, at another grand opening that we had last week, he had worked on this for, 16 years? And so that finally came to fruition in Brattleboro in July. Another source that was something that we didn't have a lot of experience with and is kind of an unusual source of funds for us is the AHP program through the Federal Home Loan Bank, and that brought in $650,000. So I think the point of this slide is just, it was a challenging funding environment, and Connie and Pete Paggi, who's our real estate development director, did a really great job of figuring out new sources of funding to make this happen. And then finally, after the project was completely funded, we applied for the TD Bank Housing for All grant competition, and we were awarded a grant of $125,000 after construction had already started. And thank God for that, because we had planned to do a gut rehab on both of the buildings. The motel had consisted of 2 buildings, and when we took the second one down and we started to take the second one apart, the mold that had been in the joists and why am I blanking on the word? The framing, thank you, was so deeply penetrated that there was no way to even mitigate it with mold remediation, and we ended up having to take the whole building down. And let me just say, this point is a bit shocking, but it illustrates the problem of housing in Brattleboro, and that is that people were living in these motel units. They were 200 square feet, and some of them were paying $1,000 a month to live in those conditions. We had one resident that we relocated, and the night before he moved out, the ceiling collapsed on him, and we hadn't touched the building yet.
So those are the conditions that some folks are living in our community, and it shows how tight the vacancy rate is and what it does to people and what it does specifically to vulnerable people. So some of those folks have moved back in because as part of the Uniform Relocation Act, we offer people a way to come back, and some folks did take advantage of that opportunity. Okay, that's that.
Next slide. So again, mission, Great River Terrace is to provide access to affordable apartments regardless of person's income, background, or disability. And we'll give a breakdown of each one of the units on one of the next slides so you can see who we targeted with each unit. Residents will be actively involved in the design of supportive services, which will reflect the residents' needs and goals. I think it's interesting to highlight here, that it's built, the shape is a horseshoe, the community center is right in the middle. The community center is already being heavily utilized, much more so than we anticipated going into that. People are really making use of it. And complementing that, we're working with our local restorative justice center to help come up with a framework in dealing with conflicts that will inevitably come up with just people living in close proximity together. And so we wanted to give a common framework both for the people that are working on the site and the people that live on the site so that they can work together to manage those. Services are, of course, voluntary, accessible, and flexible, really with a focus on self-determination and fostering independence. This is something that we as a group continually have to remind ourselves of. In terms of making requirements, people lease up when they come and move into Great River Terrace. It is their apartment. We make the services available. We use active engagement, but if somebody does not want the services, that is by all means their prerogative. And I think that goes against a lot of how service providers get in the mindset of you come in and these are the rules and you have to do this and you have to do that. We're really flipping the script on that. Great River Terrace will provide respect, the ability of residents to feel safe and comfortable in their homes, and the support for individual choice and empowerment. These are the values that we're holding up across the 3 different agencies that are working together and anybody that comes in to work on the community as well.
So how do we prioritize who gets to move into Great River Terrace? In the early thinking of this project, we committed to 11 of the apartments to be set aside for individuals that are experiencing chronic homelessness. And part of the reason for that, while the need is significant, part of the reason why we only committed 11 of the 22 units is because we didn't know that the apartments at that time were going to have deep subsidies. And so as developers and stewards of the property over the long term, we had to think about how to balance the risk, the financial risk, and without any subsidies available. So that was one of the ways that, that was one of the decisions that was made early on. And so later on in the process, though, we were able to access the 21 Section 8 for the apartments. And so we began to think about, we're technically committed to this, but what does it mean to have a property in our community that has deep subsidies for virtually every single unit? It's kind of a gift that we had to figure out what to do with, and it was the subject of a lot of conversation. We were learning from our friends up in Burlington and Beacon Apartments, and we talked to other folks about how these communities are set up. And so we made the decision that we were going to prioritize folks that were homeless for 100% of the units. But we still wanted to balance out the community and need of the residents so that we didn't we didn't overtax the capacity of our partnerships and our case managers. And so what we did is, using the coordinated entry system, we created 3 priority categories. And so 11 of the units are being drawn from those with the highest need. And so we looked at that category of folks and then took people in a ranked order so that we're really targeting people in our community that truly have the highest need. And then the second category are people with more medium need, and then the folks were ranked in that category. And then the third were people who were had short-term needs, and then we ranked people in that category. So that way we were committed to providing homes for folks in our community that were experiencing homelessness, but we were still balancing the need to have a mixed community
and make sure that the case management was matched to the need that we had on site. And then finally, we had one apartment set aside for our key holder unit.
Service planning, so as was mentioned before, and just in the interest of time, I'll fly through this slide, and if there are questions, we can have a couple minutes at the end, but also you can come in and find us after the presentation. So Groundworks has a full-time case manager that's on site, thanks to a major gift in dollars from the Department of Corrections. 2 beds in the community are set aside for Department of Corrections individuals. HCRS has a part-time case manager available on site 2 days per week, funded through some ADAP funds with the goal of increasing engagement. HCRS is really looking at this model to be able to bill for the services that they provide on site. Groundworks has independently funded positions, so we're much more flexible in terms of the criteria for working with folks. Wyndham Windsor provided an on-site support coordinator to manage the daily operations and really just making sure that things are running smoothly on a day-to-day basis. We created a host of service planning tools with support from CSH. We really relied heavily on the materials that are available through CSH, and a lot of that is available for free, which is just a wonderful resource. Includes a service plan, prioritization, release of information, and crisis plan, which are all in place. I would also say that we have the retreat. We have a clinician from the retreat that's embedded within Groundworks Collaborative, a full-time physician who also does group meetings once a week for residents, and some of the staff attend when they can, which is already proven to be successful.
So a couple of takeaways to share is building a shared culture is challenging. We had 3 separate organizations, and we're working together to build common expectations and shared culture, and I'd say it was a great experience. Yeah, it was a great experience because I think we had built enough trust among the agencies to disagree and to have moments of tension that are dynamic, that bring up a lot of deep discussion but didn't do anything to really threaten the relationship, and that's really key. And I think if you look back to Josh's earlier statement about going down to Connecticut together, going to Chicago together, all that early groundwork that was laid really helped later when we got to a lot of different decisions, some of which just because of where we each sit in the community, some of our underlying goals are different. And so we had to work through a lot of different things. So that was an important component of I think what our success is. So plan early, meet often goes right to that. Creating timelines and deadlines and hold each other accountable. So after every meeting, it was what's the next steps, when is it going to get done? I know this is sort of routine kind of stuff, but it really made a difference for us to continue to have momentum and moving forward and to build a sense of excitement and shared accomplishment together, which built on that sense of trust and that we're doing this together. We decided to lease up over in a phased period and not all at once. I think that was a really smart decision, partly because it just, even the first wave of residents coming in was overwhelming. We're talking about a fairly high need population. We were in our early stages of collaboration around, what functions, everybody who was on site, whose function was doing what, and we were figuring that out as we were bringing in a population that had a lot of needs from us, and so phasing the lease up was really important. The other thing is it allowed for an emergency that came up in the construction. We had a major thing happen 2 days before we got our certificate of occupancy. A pipe burst, and we had 100,000 gallons of water flood the basement of one of the buildings, and so we had to delay occupancy of that building by 6 weeks. So the fact that we had planned this phase lease up, we were able to switch to the other building, clean up the mess, and we actually still leased up on time. We had a deadline of September 30th. We were ahead of schedule, so that was another smart decision that we made, not knowing that was going to happen. Obtain funding that includes service delivery. That is the biggest challenge. That is the biggest challenge. And I think the takeaway is we need better coordination. If we're going to really solve this issue and tightly coordinate the way our legislators were talking about needs to happen around the state, we need a funding mechanism that you can apply for funds all at once. I think, Connie had a lot, I just talk about her fearlessness. I mean, she just really moved into the darkness, not knowing how it was going to work out in many ways. And it did, but it would have been easier to take risk as a developer and a housing provider if the funding was coordinated in all one application. And then, I know why this point's on here. Rihanna put this slideshow together and said, make sure you think, there were a lot of things that we didn't know, and we didn't have money for certain things, and we're trying to figure out how to get that now. So I don't know how you can avoid that when you're planning something brand new, but I would just say to all of you that are contemplating this, think about who's paying for the printer and the office furniture and some of those details that we don't normally fund in our development budget and they don't normally fund. At the last minute, we were kind of figuring out where we're going to get the money for that, and so avoid that problem that we had and put that in your budget. And so those are our takeaways. And I think that's the end of our presentations. Oh, here's some beautiful pictures though. So that's our community center. I think Gus had that same photo in his presentation, where you can see that's the back of the community center where there's a patio. And then to the right of that is one of the newly constructed, that's actually the one that was rehabbed. The building has 11 apartments on one side, and then on the other is the bottom picture is the front of the community center. And I think we have an interior shot on the next slide. So here's one of the residents in his new home, happy to welcome us, and some of the views from inside. And then I think, just before I forget, I thought, so this came in last night. VHCB nominated this project for an award, and it was received last night. It was the Sterling Achievement Award from the Council of State Community Development Agencies. So this project is being held up nationally as a model, and so I think Vermont is fulfilling its reputation for being innovative and on the forefront of solving problems, and something that we can all be proud of.
Excellent work, thank you. We have 10 minutes, we're going to go 5 minutes into lunch. Erhard, do you have something?
Very quickly, I just wanted to draw people's attention to two things. One is Ray Brewster over there has a fluorescent yellow sheet that he forgot to, or didn't have the opportunity to announce earlier. He's going to pass it around. It's what we affectionately titled the in-kind sheet. We kind of try to keep track of people's volunteer hours coming to these meetings, doing stuff for the Vermont Global Housing Coalition. And actually, last year we tallied up in the calendar of 2017 $65,000 worth of in-kind services by people coming to meetings, collaborating, networking through the Affordable Housing Coalition. It includes a column for your mileage, your time spent traveling to and from this meeting, and also your time at the meeting. And if you are a steering committee member, please remember to fill in the column that says how much time you spent in the steering committee. Not to be redundant, but since there's almost, I think there's actually over 90 people here today, we want to make sure we capture everybody who's here. I'm also going to pass around this other sign-in sheet, which was over there, and folks may not have seen it when you came in. So we've got dueling sign-in sheets. Please be sure to fill both of them out before you leave. Thank you.
Josh, just a comment. These sheets are pretty important, as Erhard just indicated. It helps indicate, the in-kind contribution that all of you make to the Housing Coalition. And it's important that you move the sheets around. And by the way, we have made ways of making you cooperate. If it gets held up, we will make you watch mandatory television coverage of the Supreme Court nominee hearings.
Thank you, Ryan.
So if you please keep this going.
Kevin, you have...
Yes, so I forget where your funding comes from for the staff that are located at Great River.
So part of that funding for groundworks came through a major gift, and then we fundraised for it independently. HCRS is trying to bill for the time that their clinician works on site, the counselor, but they have to fit into certain criteria, and then the housing.
For our housing support coordinator, it's being funded by a portion of the rents, both at Great River Terrace and throughout the portfolio. This person is there will eventually be there only half-time at Great River Terrace, and then we'll be providing supportive services throughout the whole portfolio. So that's how we were able to make that decision work.
So follow-up question, I'm assuming that every one of those residents has a medical home, meaning they're connected to a primary care provider?
If they don't when they come in, they do, we work with them to do that as part of it.
Where I'm going is I just wonder if that could be a funding source through the Blueprint for Health.
We should talk about that. Thank you. And I'm really cognizant of time. I can smell lunch, it's out there, but this is really important to give Bethany some time up here to talk about the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Project. I had the honor of going down to DC for the kickoff of this with Ari and Tara. And so we're back to report on that. This is a huge, just as Great River Terrace is innovation, we're leading the way in terms of really making impact. I think that this project we should share the same type of excitement, and so thanks for being here.
Thanks. I don't think I need the mic. Can you all hear me in the back? I'm generally pretty loud. I have the great honor of standing between you and lunch, so I will try to be brief. But yeah, we're really excited. I think following up on the Groundworks Collaborative is great because this is the shining example of what we're going to hope to do in the youth care world as well. So on July 13th, we were notified that we got the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Project grant funds, which is super exciting. It was a really competitive grant process. We were one of 11 sites selected. And a lot of that was our selection was based on the great work that we have been doing and we have been collaborating. I think that's evidenced by how many people are here at this meeting today and hearing some of the great stories. And Vermont is built on collaboration, and that's kind of what we'll be using to move forward. So I'm going to give you a really quick overview of the demonstration project and the timelines and where we're going. I'm going to ask people that have been involved with this Youth Homelessness Demonstration Project or the Youth Homeless Prevention Planning Committee to just raise your hand in the room, because there's a lot of us in here. So you could raise your hand. And Connie was part of it too at one point. A lot of people have been in and out of planning this work, and are great people to ask questions to, follow-up questions during lunch. So we have $2 million. The 33% of that can be used for planning funds, and so we'll be drawing down some of those planning funds. And then what's left is going to be accessible to all housing providers to create youth-specific housing. And when we're talking about youth, we're talking about youth ages 16 to 24. And so it's youth and young adults. So a lot of these people are accessing your mainstream adult housing supports already. And so this will be a way to kind of build in some really specific, developmentally appropriate services as a companion to those housing supports, and to create a lot of new innovative projects. This is a demonstration project, and so there's a lot of flexibility. I know that's not usually something that we talk about with HUD, but there is a lot of flexibility in this to look at waivers and to look at creating innovative programming that may not exist in the state yet that will really serve the youth populations that we have here. So our first step is to draft a coordinated community plan, and so we've been working hard on that already for a year. Again, that pre-work that we did, I think, helped leverage the award grant that we got, which was great. So a little over a year ago, the Youth Homeless Prevention Planning Committee started gathering, and we put out a survey, a stakeholders report. We did interviews with key constituents, and we also talked to youth, and we did focus groups with youth across the state too, to start to build an assessment of where we were, what the landscape of housing looked like in the state for young people. And so we're going to continue to build on that, and the plan is going to include So we have to have our first draft of the plan in November 13th, so a ticking clock on that. And then the final plan in March 13th. So you all, especially the Vermont Coalition to End Homelessness, is going to be seeing a lot of work over the next couple of months with pieces of the planning process coming forward. The plan will have to be voted on by the Vermont Coalition to End Homelessness in February, so that's kind of our committee's hard deadline to bring it back. And that plan will include some strategies that will be funded. Kind of, it will identify what different kinds of projects will be allowable under the funding stream, what we're going to prioritize for housing innovations. And there are some key pieces that they have to build into the program framework, including looking at the USICH youth framework around stable housing, building permanent connections, education and employment supports, and social and emotional well-being. And so I think, what we're trying to do is take this positive youth development and trauma-informed care framework and map it on to housing supports. And looking at that co-location of services, looking at those innovative partnerships between already existing youth service providers and housing providers, looking at where that Venn diagram kind of overlaps. A big piece of the work is partner involvement. We have a stakeholder committee that's been meeting. We're meeting once a month now as the plan is kicking into high gear in the planning phase. Our next meeting is the 24th, next Monday. If anyone's interested in joining or sitting in on that at any time, there's always seats available there, or we'll make them. One of the other really exciting pieces about this is the development of a youth action board. And I think this is so important that we're involving people that are impacted by the programs that we're developing in developing those programs. And so we are pulling together an action board for youth ages 16 to 24 with lived experience. If you know of any youth that may be interested in being on that board, it's compensated. We value youth time, and we think it's important that we're not showing up for the work as volunteers, and neither should they. So we have built-in compensation. We'll be working on travel support and all of that, and it will include a lot of leadership development, and they're going to be a key part of our decision-making matrix. And so they're not just advising us or informing us, but we're actually bringing our plan to them, and they're going to be the ones that are approving it along with the Vermont Coalition to End Homelessness. So we need approval for both that Youth Action Board and the Vermont Coalition. So a lot of moving parts right now. The other piece, so I handed out some eligible projects, the eligible populations under the Youth Homeless Demonstration Project. And I think it's really important to note that there's some expansion within this demonstration project. What they want to see is that we're looking at these definitions and these categories, and we're trying to make sure that youth have access within those existing categories. And so they've done some reframing of a couple of them, including category 2, eminent risk of homelessness, and you'll see that with family or friends being asked to leave within 14 days. So there's a lot more room for precarious housed and couch surfing youth to be served under category 2. And then they've also done some work expanding category 4, fleeing violence, to really, I think that's been kind of thought of as a person that's being victimized by a domestic violence perpetrator, fleeing violence, and like that kind of direct one-on-one intimate partner violence. But I think that this really talks about how youth experience violence, that there's violence in their family, that there's risk of violence, and so it opens up that category a lot more to how the young people that we're serving show up and need. The one really cool thing, so this project is 2 years to do all this really cool innovation, but then after that, HUD is committed to sustaining a certain level of funding going forward and building that into the COC NOFA. Is that right, Daniel? I get my words around the housing world stuff mixed up all the time, so I'm always like, am I saying the right thing? And so any project that we fund that is a renewable project will be built into the ongoing NOFA. So this is sustained funding going forward for a long time, which is amazing. That it's not just a one and done deal, but that we're really talking about increasing the base for Vermont housing providers across the board. I'm gonna pass out one other thing. I did not make enough copies of this for everybody, but this is a youth homeless demonstration project type summary, and it talks about the different kinds of projects that are fundable under this new funding stream. And so, again, sorry that there's not. It was a pretty long document, and I work at a nonprofit, so so there's not copies for everybody. But if you don't get one and you would like it to be available, I can certainly email it to you after. So one of the things that we really want to make sure is that you, as adult housing providers, know, and mainstream housing providers, know that this funding is for you. I think that there's been some thinking that this is, RHY funding, Runway for Runaway and Homeless Youth programs, and while this is definitely geared towards supporting that system as well, there's something for everybody here, and we're all stakeholders in this work. I invite the team to add on to that. I feel I've been trying to be quick, but did I miss anything really big? We're just at the beginning of this really exciting stuff, so it's all kind of amorphous and a little bit hazy right now, but I think really quickly we're gonna, I know one really exciting part. What were you gonna say, Tara? Okay, one other really exciting thing that is happening is that we're hiring a youth homeless demonstration project coordinator. We just announced the position yesterday. Y'all be getting an email, I'm sure, within the next couple days about it in your inbox. Applications are due October 6th. And we are going to be really excited to have that support because one of the other cool things is that this project has technical assistance providers up the wazoo. And so we have literally 7 technical assistance providers available to us, and that one looking really focused on education, one focused on our youth work that we're doing and creating really meaningful youth-adult partnerships, and another from TAC, who a lot of us have worked with before, that's really helping guide us along the way. And so we're really thankful to have all this access to all this technical assistance, but we also needed a coordinator to help kind of pull it all in and lead the way. So we're really thankful to the Department for Children and Families and Vermont Coalition to End Homelessness for helping support that coordinator position going forward. And I think this is going to be really groundbreaking. I think that there's so much cool energy in the state. When we were doing our stakeholder interviews with people, there was so much compassion and care for youth populations and a real desire to figure out how to serve those populations best. And some really innovative thinking around what that could look like. I can't tell you how many times we heard about tiny house villages for youth populations. I think Vermont is the right state to really make an impact on how to serve rural homeless youth. Yeah.
I just want to clarify something you said, because I just may have missed it in the speed, that some kind of plan is due November or something.
Yeah, our very first coordinated community plan draft, which is just a very initial draft. Apparently, during the first round, somebody just submitted their name on a piece of paper. We're going to set the bar a little higher than that.
So how many, it's exciting to hear about the innovation and the demonstration aspects and the flexibility. And for those of us who knew you got $2 million but didn't know anything beyond that, does that mean that we have until the end of October to come up with something and say it to you? Or does that mean that you've just identified partners and what your plan is to then solicit ideas?
Yeah, thank you for asking for clarification on that. So the timeline is November 13th, we have this draft plan in. The plan is not going to dictate what all the specific projects. It's gonna talk about categories and our priorities for projects. And what those projects will need to include. So more of a loose plan of saying this is where our gaps are, this is where we think the priorities are for moving forward. So once we have our coordinated community plan accepted, it's due March 13th. Once that's accepted, then you all will be able to develop project applications after that. and funding will come in. So once the plan is accepted, we can do the project application. So we expect by late summer, early fall of 2019 to have project funds coming in for you. So now is a great time to start building partnerships with your local youth service provider. You can find a list of some of them on our VCRIP website and find your local member program if you're not sure who your youth service provider is. And to also look at what are those coalitions and partnerships within your region that can be, kind of those collaborative bodies and be really creative in finding solutions together.